This picture was taken in 1990 and shows my dad and me on the summit of Ben Nevis. It's one of my favourite things we did together, but experiencing the joy of mountains wasn't the only thing I learned from him. Both my parents encouraged us children to enjoy what the world had to offer. Dad had been a keen naturalist in early life and taught us a lot about the various plants and animals we might encounter on our excursions. It wasn't surprising then that I grew up loving natural scenery. In my case, my own homeland wasn't enough and I explored other countries whenever I could afford the money and the time. Mountain High is about that sense of comfort I can get simply by chilling out somewhere remote. I used to go out a lot and make time-lapse sequences, sometimes at night and often in a remote location. I was never as intrepid as the best of them, but I had my moments. My love for psychedelic dub can be traced back through the music of Ott, a master of the craft, to before that when I discovered the music of Spongle and first began to realise how delicious audio could be in the right hands. The general idea of Mountain High is that someone is camped in the woods and has got up early to finish their climb of the mountain peak. I imagined that person would feel so high on the vivid immediacy of the environment that they'd have no need for drugs. The choice of psychedelic genre is therefore intentionally ironic in my own terms, although everyone is welcome to interpret it however they like, and indeed, I encourage that. In this video, I'll talk a little about circles, rings of diodes, circular speed changes, and a rather unusual percussion instrument. Let's get started. Take a look at this circuit diagram. It's one way of showing the components of what's called a ring modulator. The name comes from the ring of diodes used in the circuit. Modern ring modulators usually don't use this arrangement, but the name has stuck. Ring modulators have various uses outside of music, but let's focus on the audio properties. You've almost certainly heard a ring modulator in isolation, as they were used to create the voices of the Daleks in Doctor Who. I did spend some time trying to come up with a full explanation of ring modulation mathematics involving hyperbolic surfaces and Lissajous figures, but I decided there wasn't time in this video. Perhaps I'll make another video one day to explain it all. Here's the simple version. Ring modulators are multipliers. Specifically, they are four-quadrant bipolar multipliers, but don't worry if that sounds too technical, it just means they can multiply negative values as well as positive ones. There are two inputs, and the output is the product of their values. Here's an example showing two sine waves as inputs, one of them at 2 Hz and the other at 3 Hz. Obviously that's sub-audio, but this is for illustration only, so let's keep the numbers simple. As we turn up the inputs, watch what happens to the output at the bottom. Look closely. As soon as one input goes negative, the output becomes inverted, until the other input goes negative as well, when it goes positive again. A minus times a minus is a plus. Think about how many times the input waves cross the 0 line. The 2 Hz wave crosses 4 times, and the 3 Hz wave crosses 6 times. Each time the output wave also crosses, making a total of 10 crossings, which corresponds to 5 Hz, the sum of the two input frequencies. You've probably heard that ring modulators create the sum and difference of the input frequencies. Well, this isn't a rigorous proof, but hopefully it makes the origin of the sum frequency a little more intuitive to grasp. It did for me. As for the difference frequency, perhaps it's easiest to think of that as arising because of interference. A 2 Hz wave and a 3 Hz wave are in sync exactly every second, which is why there's a 1 Hz component in the output as well. It's all about the amplitude this time. When both signals are far from the 0 line, the output will be as well, and this will happen once per second. Now I'll show that mixing together the sum and difference frequencies, in this case 1 Hz and 5 Hz, can produce the exact same output as the multiplication performed by the ring modulator. We have to do a little phase shifting left and right, but it's possible to get them to line up. So there you go, the sum of the input frequencies and the difference between the input frequencies. This is the first thing you normally hear people say about ring modulators, but I think it's easier to look first at what they do and then go from there. A quick word about the sonic qualities of ring modulation. In general, not only are the input frequencies absent from the output, but the output frequencies are not even harmonically related to them. In other words, they're not integer multiples of the inputs. This can sound rather dissonant because the human ear tends to seek out harmonic relationships. It's no coincidence that in early synthesizers, ring modulators were often used to imitate the inharmonic tones of bells. However, there's an edge case, and it's quite musically useful as it turns out. If one of the two input signals is very low in frequency, then the output will be much closer to the frequency of the other input. Think about it. If you have a small number and a large number, then the sum of the two will be a little above the large number, and the difference will be a little below it. If I use a concert A of 440 Hz in one input, and a 10 Hz wave, which is like a fast vibrato, in the other input, then the output will contain two components at 430 Hz and 450 Hz. Incidentally, the ear will detect a beat frequency, which is the difference between these two, i.e. 20 Hz, and this is twice the low frequency input. If I then decrease the frequency of the 10 Hz wave until it becomes very close to zero, two things will happen. First, the beat frequency will slow until it pretty much disappears, and second, the output components will get close to the original pitch from different directions, which you might be able to picture as a sort of V shape lying on its side. Perhaps something like this? Yes, that is indeed a ring modulator. Its converging frequencies clearly visible in the spectrogram of Mountain High. It's hard to exaggerate how excited I was when I noticed that, because I'd never seen it before. So how was I applying this effect to the track? Well, I started with the idea that I wanted two axes of control. One axis would change the frequency gap, and the other the intensity. In Bitwig it's possible to do this with an XY control, which allows you to move a dot around a square and control the two modulation values simultaneously. So I built a simple circuit in the Bitwig effects grid. This is fantastic fun to play with. You can start with a fairly high frequency effect wave, say around 200 Hz, which creates weird sideband tones over the original sound. And then as you reduce the frequency until it hits sub-audio around 20 Hz, it turns into a fast sort of fluttering sound, where the pitch of the original audio is being converged on rapidly. So that's ring modulators. It's a deep topic and I haven't done it full justice here, but I hope it was interesting. It's time to talk about this bit. What's happening here exactly? It sounds as if the tempo is increasing all the time, and yet we end up back where we began, at 124 beats per minute. How is that possible? This is known as a RISSET rhythm. To explain how it works, I think it's most useful to look first at one of its close cousins, the Shepard tone. Human hearing is pretty good at detecting changes in pitch, and less good at detecting gradual changes in timbre. The Shepard tone takes advantage of this by using one to disguise the other. This is a spectrogram of a Shepard tone. You can see that the sound is composed of a number of frequencies at octave intervals, as they all rise slowly in pitch, distracting the listener into noticing the upward movement. The timbre is being sneakily altered behind the scenes by gradually fading out the highest component while fading in the new lowest one. It's quite hard to notice unless you're paying attention, and you're left with the unsettling feeling that the pitch is increasing without end, yet remaining in the same place, like someone walking up a down escalator. The RISSET rhythm is very similar to the Shepard tone in that they're both fading in some components while fading out others. In this case, components that are fast are fading out while slower components are fading in. This is much harder to accomplish than it is with the Shepard tone due to the fact that rhythmic pattern changes are actually easier to spot than changes in timbre, despite the fact that they're actually very similar things at different scales, and I'm sure we'll be discussing that in a future video. Here's how the effect was achieved in the case of Mountain High. Take any percussion loop or bass part, basically anything that can be looped, and make 2 copies of it on separate tracks so that they both play at once. Make one of the copies twice as fast so it's half as long in duration, and create a second repeat of it to bring it back to the same length as before. Now we have 2 simultaneous loops, one twice the speed of the other, but otherwise identical. The trick is to edit the musical events contained in these loops so that the faster one fades out while the slower one fades in. Ideally, you want the slower loop to replace the faster one quite seamlessly, as if the whole thing were a single part that had been constructed to work on its own. This requires some creative thinking, and I do it in a 2-step process. Step 1 is to remove any events that have ended up duplicated on top of one another. For example, if I'm doing a bass part, it's common for many notes to be used more than once, increasing the odds that the same note will appear in both loops at the same time. The one I choose to remove depends on where we are in time. If we're not yet halfway through the whole thing, then the faster loop is supposed to be dominant, so I remove the note in the slower loop. If we're more than halfway through, I remove the note in the faster loop, because that's the loop that's on the way out. Step 2 is to actually apply the fade in to the slower loop and the fade out to the faster one, as described earlier. I usually do this with note velocities, but it's important to note that the way a particular synth or sample responds to velocity can make a big difference here, and it might be necessary to use volume instead. It can take a bit of tweaking to achieve something that sounds naturally musical, but if you do a good enough job, the final result should be a loop segment that can be followed seamlessly by a double speed version of itself. And now the icing goes onto the cake. When you use the loop in some music, you want the tempo to ramp up from the start to the end of the loop until it's running at double speed. For the next repeat of the loop, you need to have an abrupt drop in the tempo to its original value, followed by another ramp. Rinse and repeat. The reason this works is because the end of the loop has been made very similar to a half-speed version of the beginning. So when you join them together with a ramp up to double speed, then an abrupt drop, it makes them match very well. Of course, you can slow down as well. You just reverse all the rules, fading out where you faded in, and using ramps that go down to half tempo instead. Just for completeness, let's hear a couple of the individual parts involved in this RISSET section of Mountain High. bass and synth parts were a bit trickier to do than the drums because of the involvement of pitches. I did consider changing the note pitches in line with the tempo, but I quickly realised it would sound rather too avant-garde for the genre. Instead, I had to make note choices that fit fairly well with the way the tempo was changing. And the skylark? Well, the way the music rises made me think of The Lark Ascending by Vaughan Williams. This particular bird was recorded near my house in a field, and I also used it at the end of the track, where I duplicated it lots of times and messed around with crazy speed changes to make it sound like a whole flock of deranged larks. The final circles of which I'd like to speak are these. The very first thing I tried when I got Bitwig was making my own sampled instrument. I chose to sample these pans in the kitchen because I'd just bought them and I thought they had quite a nice tone when hit with a wooden spoon. I sampled them fairly extensively, using various amounts of force when hitting them and recording a number of versions of each hit so I could use the round robin feature in Bitwig's sampler. There are 3 pans with different pitches and timbres, and I arranged them so that each one dealt with a particular keyboard range. So here we are at the end of the second behind the scenes video. This one took me quite a while because there was a lot of detail to cover and I wanted to do it full justice. I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button and let me know what you think or ask any questions you might have in the comments below. I'm already working on video number 3, which is about the next track, Summer Isle. So if you want to catch that one when it's released, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. You can also follow me on Bandcamp for regular news updates. I'm also working on my next release, which is a cyberpunk themed 4-track mini album with a message of hope. The genre is kind of progressive funky synthwave. That's what I'm calling it, yeah. So thank you very much for watching, and until next time, look after yourselves.